Hi everybody, it's week 10 and that means three things. One is it is the week before spring break. So that's good. And you know what I'm hoping for this year? My spring break wish is actually to see snow melting. Um, I hope we can all get that. The second thing is that there is no discussion this week because of the third thing. And the third thing is that um, you have the next part of your policy analysis project due this week, which is talking about your alternatives and your evaluation criteria. I've talked to a couple students already about that, had some good discussions on that, and just as a reminder, if you want to talk about that on the phone, um, or even in person if you happen to be at UNO on the days I'm there, which is typically Wednesday and Thursday, um, I would welcome that as well. So anyway, I want to talk this week about the readings I gave you from the Clemens and Macbeth text, as well as a couple of um, supplemental readings. They're not really readings, they're actually listening to some mini podcasts um, that I gave you this week. So let me get right to that. Okay, so here's this famous quote from Aristotle, right? So remember, the order of famous Greek philosophers, Socrates and his student Plato. Plato wrote everything about Socrates, and then Plato's student Aristotle, right? So they have come up with a lot of these great quotes on what we call Western civilization, um, and they really are interesting quotes. Though probably this famous one by Aristotle is that man is by nature a political animal, right? He says man is by nature a political animal, and so then he goes on to say, hence it is evident that the state is a creation of nature, that is the nature, that man is by nature a political animal, and he who by nature and not by mere accident is without a state is either above humanity or below it. So he's essentially tribeless, lawless, hearthless, meaning, without a home. An outcast who is a lover of war and compared to a bird which flies alone. Okay, so this actually should remind you of what Hobbes said about the state of nature being short and brutish. And so the point is that if we kind of think about what we rely on as the foundations of at least the American version of democracy, it's this idea that we we are political animals, meaning that we associate together. And what Aristotle, might be foreshadowing is what Hobbes and Rousseau, not Hobbes so much as Rousseau and John Locke talked about, this idea of a social contract, right? That that we somehow um, gather together in groups, and in doing so, we have to give up some of our individuality um, in in preference for the greater good. And so we create this social contract, which is, essentially a charter or a constitution, if you will. But of course, the this idea of Aristotle also has some downsides, right? Um, and that is that it's not just association, but it could mean also that we're prone to tribalism, right? So we argue about this all the time. We argue about tribal politics, but we also argue about what appears to be empirical, and that is that humans tend to gather themselves together in tribes, and sometimes these tribes have benefits, but sometimes tribes also have a lot of detriments too, and the biggest among those is that tribes fight each other, um, and and we can see that, right, as sort of this empirical fact from history. But the point is that we do actually form together politically, and I think that's what Aristotle was getting at. And so the Clemens and Macbeth chapters that I assigned you to read sort of talk about the rationalist model versus the non-rational model of policy analysis and policy implementation. So Clemens and Macbeth, as I've mentioned before, they consider themselves not to be strictly rationalists, and their book could come across as being critical of rationalism. Um, but I want to sort of draw back from that a little bit and look at the idea that my thinking is that policy has certainly elements of rationalism and certainly elements of non-rationalism built into it. So what do I mean by that? So first of all, the rationalist model. I mean, the the underlying assumption of rationalism in terms of policy might be that we are all this economic person, right? Homo economicus, right? The economic man. So that assumption is that humans are completely rational and had an ordered set of preferences that they understand, which means complete knowledge, and they seek to maximize utility based on their preferences and knowledge. So utility is often defined as money, but it doesn't have to be. And in fairness to economists, they really say that they assume that humans act as if rational. So I gave you a couple of optional supplemental podcasts to listen to, and I got it from Marketplace. I am a fan of Marketplace.org with Kai Ryssdal and Molly Wood and others. I do like that show and their spin-off podcasts, but they have this interview with Richard Thaler, who is, one of the champions of what is called behavioral economics, and also an interview with Robert Shiller, who is not necessarily a behavioral economist, but he was defending the idea that Thaler deserved the Nobel Prize for economics. But what Thaler is really talking about is that psychology has a lot to do with the economic decisions that people make, because what Thaler says is that people aren't always rational. And so how can economics explain the behavior of people if they aren't always rational, right? And so my thinking on that is that one of the things that helps to do behavioral economics is actually to explain the psychology behind this utility function, right? What is utility for individuals, and what is utility for individuals collected together in the polis? So let me move on from that. This idea of the rationalist model. I'm kind of going back to PA 8050 and thinking about this. So politics and policy are really the same root word, right? The polis. So the polis in the Greek sense is literally the city. So when Socrates and Plato and Aristotle talk about the state, they're really talking about the city-state, right? And it's a body of citizens. So let's be clear that when they talked about that body of citizens, there was whole swaths of people that they left out of that body of citizens, right? Probably women, certainly slaves, and others. And so in a sense, the Greek city-state could probably be thought of as an aristocracy. But be that as it may, they were defining this polis as a body of citizens. But for us, living in a democratic state, politics is really the way we find ways to resolve our disagreements with each other within a constituted framework, which, again, I mean constitutions or city charters or bylaws, really short of killing each other. And I kind of mean that literally, because that kind of harkens back to the Hobbesian state of nature, right? So absent that, we might find cause to inflict harm on each other. But we form these constitutions so that we can resolve our disagreements, and it's implicit that we have disagreements within a framework, right? So going to Wilson, the first thing we have everybody read when you enter an MPA program is Woodrow Wilson, this 1887 article on politics and administration. And so Wilson talked about this politics administration dichotomy. So he roughly implied that what he called politics is, if you read what he says, is kind of somehow full of emotion, deal making, pressure from interest groups, um, log rolling within legislative bodies, um, backroom deals. So things that we would think of as dirty in politics, right? But that somehow through that process, we get policies that are rational and achievable. And so Wilson really implies that even though these politicians, elected officials, are somehow sullied by this process, they actually are somehow able to turn out policy that is completely rational and can be implemented. And so Wilson called for this idea of a cadre or a core of people who were the administrators who were able to get into administration because they were trained and educated and because they were able to apply business practices. And he used the word business practices, right? He said that administration makes government more business-like. And so in that statement, what he meant was that business was always completely rational, so that business is somehow devoid of emotion and irrationality. Now, um, whether he's right about that is another question, but that was his assertion, right? So there necessarily had to be a dichotomy between politics and administration because the politics part tended towards irrationality, even though it produced rational policy, and the administration part tended towards rationality in its implementation. And so, if policy making worked the way it should, this is what it would look like. And I borrowed this from Paul Kearney on his website, which I've referred to before. But this is the policy cycle, right? And there's several versions of the policy cycle, but this is how this would work. So first of all, up there in the upper right-hand corner, you see the red font just showed up, is agenda setting. So that means that elected officials set some kind of legislative agenda based on input from constituents. So there's a concern, elected officials take it up, put it on the agenda. And next is policy formulation. So elected officials, still in this case, formulate a workable policy design. So we're still on the politics side here, right? Then there's legitimation. The policy, once it's created, is legitimate because, specifically because, it was passed by a representative body within the constitutional or charter framework of that polity, of that political entity, right? So it has the stamp of legitimacy on it because it was passed through the process, the constituted process. And then we have implementation. So this is where, if policymaking worked the way Wilson said it should, this is where administrators take over, right? So the first time administrators deal with the policies in implementation. And so they use their expert methods to carry out the clear orders as given in the policy itself. All right, so that's occurring. And then we have evaluation. So here is where policy analysts come into play. Wilson never mentioned policy analysts, but evaluation of methods, it fits into what Wilson was saying, right? So if you have these rational actors who are administrators, then we can use things, methods, to actually understand whether a policy achieves its purposes. And we can actually recommend changes. And that leads us to policy maintenance, succession, or termination. So based on evaluation, elected officials might make changes to the policy to make it more effective or more efficient or more equitable, or all those things that Kraft mentions in chapter 6, right? So that's the cycle. And so what the cycle actually assumes is that policy moves in this kind of linear path. Now, it's a circular model because we keep doing it in an iterative manner, but it still moves in this linear path. Well, many critics, many scholars have rightly pointed out that policy doesn't necessarily move in this linear path. But why the policy cycle is useful for us, especially studying policy, and why it's useful for practitioners is because it provides a common vocabulary, right? The vocabulary of agenda setting, policy formulation, legitimation, implementation, evaluation, policy maintenance, succession, or termination, those are important because we can all speak the same language. So Dye was famous for setting out a rational model of policy and decision making. And so let me just kind of stop right there. And this is something I think you know and have really caught on to. The models of policy making and the models of decision making are really very akin to each other. So one of the really cool things about talking about policy, I think, is that we're actually, we can break it out from the idea of just talking about public policy, which is important in and of itself, and we can take it back into public administration in the form of the ways that organizations make decisions. So organizations, public organizations, nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, how do organizations make decisions on things like what programs should we add, what programs should we eliminate, how do we change our methodology or our procedures, or how do we decide to build a new building? All these things are really very akin to policy. And so the models really can apply in both directions, and that takes us back to what we talk about in public administration, which is running and managing and leading public and nonprofit organizations. So this is Dye's rational decision-making model. So he's talking about decision-making, but it also applies to policy and decision-making, right? So what this looks like, and you can read it as I'm talking, I'm not going to read every single one of the 6 blocks there. What this looks like is a logic model, right? We have inputs, and then we have activities, which are activities and outputs, and then we have, well, I should say we have activities, and then we have outputs, and then we have outcomes, right? So this process, which Dye describes, is completely rational because it starts with, in number 1, your complete set of goals. So you're going into the process with your goals known. So this kind of takes us back to the economic person model, right? You have a complete set of goals and you understand how each goal weighs against each other, right? And you have complete inventory of knowledge. So you know what your values are and you know how they stack up. And then you have a complete set of alternative policies. And then that helps you actually to prepare how each alternative will stack up against each other. For example, in a cost-benefit analysis or in a cost-effectiveness analysis. And then you can actually calculate the gain or the loss from each alternative, and then you make a decision, right? So in the military, what we did was we presented commanders with courses of action. And so it very much followed this rational decision-making model, whether or not we were rational in the process or not, but we made it look rational. So we said, here's what we know, here's what the intelligence tells us, and we are trying to achieve these particular objectives. And so based on our objectives and based on the intelligence, we give the commander courses of action, which is a COA. So we said COA 1 says do this, COA 2 says do that, COA 3 says do this other thing, and based on our modeling and based on our analysis, we recommend you take COA 2, right? But you don't have to. But the point was that it was a purely rational model. And so, but there's other models of policymaking that we like, but there are also, again, as a reminder, models of decision making within organizations. So this one's famous, everybody likes it because it's kind of intuitive, but this only has to do with agenda setting. So think back to my 2 slides ago on the policy process. Agenda setting is just one part of the policy process, right? If of that linear circular process. So all John Kingdom was talking about was agenda setting, right? He's been criticized by people because it wasn't rigorous enough, but all Kingdom was ever talking about was agenda setting, and that's getting something on the agenda. And so he had these streams, right? The problem stream, the policy stream, and the politics stream. And what he said was these streams operate independently of one another. It's like 3 parallel rivers running together, but at some point there's a window of opportunity where those streams can actually merge, and then out of that comes a policy decision. So how's that work? So Kingdon said there's this problem stream. And the point with the problem stream is there are always problems, right? We have societal problems, just almost an unlimited number of societal problems. But we don't always pay attention to them necessarily. But events or indicators might force them onto the decision agenda, right? So we think of triggering events like disasters or crises, like indicators or studies. And I'm going to get to some of this more in some of these other models, but we now have a Department of Homeland Security. The way we came up with the Department of Homeland Security was post 9/11. We said that, you know, we don't have a single department that protects the homeland. Well, that was a problem before that people had identified. There was actually many studies, you know, indicating that a department of something like a Department of Homeland Security should be formed. But we had this triggering event. And then there's the policy stream, which Kingdon calls the policy primeval soup, right? So that's just basically, if you think of something like a policy network, that's a lot of people who talk about various policies, right? So there are people who are experts in education policy. There are people who are experts in environmental policy. There are people who are experts in recreation policy. So there's all kinds of ideas out there, and when this triggering event happens, often what policymakers do is reach into the primeval soup, and they're reaching for policy ideas because they're there. And depending on someone's partisan bent, they might grab certain policies out of this soup, or they might grab others. And then there's the politics stream, and that is what Kingdom was talking about, was the policy makers, whether that be elected officials or agencies, that they actually have the authority to put policy into effect, but that's greatly influenced by what's happening in that stream at the moment, right? What for example, do particular partisans reach for, and what are influencing them right at the moment? And then there's the window of opportunity. So when the streams cross, they actually put all 3 of those things together. But again, all Kingdom was talking about was agenda setting. And then there's another model of agenda setting, actually, which one of the things that Kingdom used was this Cobb-Elder model way back in 1972. And this explicates a little more fully what some of these things are that happen in the agenda setting model, right? So there's a stage 1, a stage 2, and a stage 3 in the Cobb-Elder model. So there's an initiator and a trigger device. So you should see that from Kingdon. And those come together for issue creation, right? So this is the problem. That's really like a problem statement, which is, it's kind of the first cut at the problem statement, because then you come to issue definition and symbol utilization. So what you're doing there is you're saying, okay, look, we have a problem with Social Security, and here it is. And so let me define it for you. The problem with Social Security is the trust fund's going to go broke in 2030. That's the problem. And so we have to find a way to put more money into the trust fund. Or another person could say, well, we have a problem with Social Security, and the problem with Social Security is that it unnecessarily pays people of means, gives them a Social Security check every month. And a person with a net worth of, $5 million doesn't need a $3,000 Social Security check every month, whereas a person with a net worth of nothing probably needs a Social Security check every month, and it probably needs to be more than $1,200. So we're defining that as the issue, right? And so then we're kind of getting into symbol utilization, right? And that really is what these advocates use to actually give you the shorthand version of what they mean by the policy problem, right? So certain things, and these can be memes as we know them now. They could be, that kind of imagery. They could be actually verbal imagery, right? We can say the National Rifle Association uses the imagery of the Second Amendment. So when the National Rifle Association says Second Amendment, they mean one thing. Well, there's a whole lot of scholarship on the Second Amendment. I'm just here to tell you that, there's a whole lot of historical scholarship on the meaning of the Second Amendment. It's actually quite complicated. But when the National Rifle Association says the Second Amendment, they mean one thing, right? So groups, advocates for policy, use symbols, right? And so then that leads to its expansion in the media and to a larger public. And then finally in stage 3, where, Cobb and Elder talk about patterns of access, institutional agenda, and action of allocation, what they're really talking about, access means that certain people have access to the policymaking process, and some don't, and some have more weight in their access. And then there's an institutional agenda. So this leads us into realizing that institutions in government, this could be departments, actually have a play as well. So if someone is talking about defense policy, the Department of Defense does not sit idly by neutrally and accept policy from Congress and implement it. Neither do any other departments. The institutions themselves actually have priorities that they make known to Congress. And then there's the action of allocation, which is really, just think of allocation really just means budgets. How do we express policy through budgets, right? So that's kind of the more expanded version of Kingdon from Cobb and Elder. And I just talked about all that, so I'm not going to go into that on this slide. I apologize, I forgot I had this slide here, but you can take a look at this as well. Okay, so then there's one model called the Advocacy Coalition Framework, and there's one following this, which I like because they sort of get into the guts of who the people are within policymaking. So Sabatier and Jenkins Smith came up with this Advocacy Coalition Framework in the 90s and kept expanding it. So what they were saying, what the bottom line of what Sabatier and Jenkins Smith were saying was that policy is not just some linear process where policymakers involve themselves to create a policy. What they said was that for each policy domain or each policy area, and they were looking again mostly at the federal level, but actually, they did some work at the state level and regional level as well. And so you can look at it from any level of government that you want. What they said was that for each policy domain, coalitions develop. And these coalitions are really what they call advocacy coalitions. That is, people who combine with each other to advocate certain policy positions. And so they are coalitions. The people in a coalition might not always agree with each other on everything. And in fact, they might be part of opposing coalitions on other policy domains. But so these aren't political parties. Coalitions are not political parties. But they are policy domain by policy domain. These coalitions form to influence the shape of policy. So they could be working to influence how policy is created, or they could be working together to influence changes to policy, or they could be working together, for example, on how policy is even brought to the agenda in the first place, or how policy might be kept off the agenda in the first place. So you see over there in the far right box, coalition A, coalition B. So these coalitions have policy beliefs and they have resources. And so from that, they create strategies which lead to decisions by the governmental authorities. And then this leads to sometimes institutional rules, resource allocations, appointments, and then policy outputs and policy impacts, right? So that's the policy subsystem, that far right box. That is the policy subsystem. But what they also did was they went back and they recognized that, the policy subsystem itself, each policy subsystem, does not exist in a vacuum. That's influenced by structural elements, right? And what are those structural elements? So they talked about relatively stable parameters, external system events, and then long-term coalition opportunity struggle. So what were they talking about with that? So those two boxes on the left, relatively stable parameters, are things we would think of sort of as the constitutional framework, right? And so, the Constitution says that, we provide, that the United States provides for the general welfare. So general welfare is a clause from the Constitution under which we put a lot of policy, right? The Constitution says that the United States government provides for the common defense. So the common defense is sort of a relatively stable thing. There's an acceptance that the United States central government, that is the federal government, provides for the common defense. That's baked into our Constitution, right? So that doesn't change necessarily. That idea doesn't change. What changes are the particulars of what that means. Because the box below that, there are external events. We have, what are some of those things? Right? We see changes in socioeconomic conditions, right? We see business cycles where we have periods of recession, for example, or periods of depression. We see changes long-term in public opinion. We might see changes in the systematic governing coalition. So, for example, in the stuff I've studied, defense, World War II is a watershed, not just because it was this horrific war, it was a horrific war, but what it changed was sort of the governing coalition in the United States with regard to what the United States military should look like. So previous to World War II, Democrats and Republicans were both very much on board with the idea that the United States should have a small military force, that it should have really just a small professional force that we would augment with surges during wartime. So we saw these surges during wartime, right, in the history of the United States. We saw a very big surge during the Civil War. We saw a surge during World War I, and we saw a very big surge during World War II, right? But the assumption, the going in governing assumption vis-a-vis the military was that post-conflict, after peace had been achieved, that we would go back to the small military force, the small cadre force that we could once again build up in wartime to a large force. Well, that stopped. Post-World War II, we decided, and I say we, both Democrats and Republicans, in Congress and the administration, this is a simplistic version because there's a lot of arguing, but decided that, no, what's really needed is a force that we could call on a quicker notice. And so we ended up with something that the founding fathers necessarily did not believe in, and that is a standing army, if you will. So that was a change in both public opinion and a change in the systematic governing coalition that had to do with that. And so you can think of that in other policy areas as well. And so these things operate to influence the policy subsystem, but also these things flow through the opportunities that the coalitions themselves have. So the coalitions, in a rational sense, are actually aware of what's going on with the parameters and the events, and this gives them opportunities to plug into the political subsystem. So the bottom line on advocacy coalition is that it actually works to change policy in various ways and plug into various parts of, going back to that policy cycle, plug into various parts of that policy cycle at various times. And so I talked about this again. And so here's just a wrap up of that. I'm not going to go into this again. So the last thing, or one of the last things, is the punctuated equilibrium that Baumgartner and Jones came up with in 1993. And they basically wrote a lot more about that over the coming years. They're still writing about it. So what did they talk about? They're contemporaries with ACF. So what Baumgartner and Jones really started out doing was they started out by looking at budgets, and they were challenging, what scholars like Lindblom had said. Lindblom, as you remember, said that, that budgets move in incremental ways. And in fact, Lindblom said that that's preferable, right? Because if agencies have incremental increases in their budgets, then they can adjust, and the political partisans who might oppose each other can actually adjust their expectations, and we can sort of muddle through. Lindblom's words, we can muddle through and we can create good policy and good implementation because we're proceeding incrementally. Well, so Baumgartner and Jones said incrementalism really didn't happen. What actually happened was punctuated equilibrium, that sometimes policies moved along in an equilibrium manner, but then they were punctuated. So that's what that line represents, that budget line. So if you took a straight line budget line over time, it would move from left to right up over time, right? That just talks about incremental increases in your budget. But sometimes, and that's the gray box in the middle, there are periods of increased attention. So what are periods of increased attention? And this is akin to triggering events, but it's really more over a period. So legislators might start seeing budget indicators moving out of control, or they might see increased media attention or public attention to a problem, and they might see changes to a policy image frame. So if you think about the Department of Corrections in Nebraska, for example, or this could have really applied to any state, you start noticing increases to the prison population. Well, why is the prison population increasing? Well, that actually causes you to ask that question. And you could go back and you could say, well, the prison population started increasing when we started enforcing things like 3-strike laws, or when we started applying mandatory sentencing that judges had to abide by. And so this might cause a change to the policy, right? And so there we see a punctuation. And so what causes the punctuation? Well, in this case, we might say, the policy makers might say, well, look, we have this increased prison population and it's causing, a whole set of problems all of its own within the institution. And so what do we have to do about it? Well, what they might do about it, in fact, is appropriate a lot more money for the Department of Corrections. But what they might also do about it is go back and revisit, for example, some of these other laws, right? So they might revisit laws that require prison sentences for distributing small amounts of marijuana, for example. Or they might go back and revisit mandatory sentencing laws that are imposed on the judicial system. Or they might go back and look at sentencing guidelines overall and say, could we handle some of the law-breaking population with, for example, probation? And so then you reach a new policy equilibrium, and then the policy sort of starts all over. So what Baumgartner and Jones actually contribute to this is this idea that sort of flies in the face of rationalism, and here's how. What they really say is that policymakers, and they actually studied the national level of government, is that policymakers really have a limited attention span, because they said that instead of human beings being rational, completely rational, human beings possess bounded rationality. And that goes back to Simon way back in the 50s, who came up with this term bounded rationality. And that is, all of us really would like to make rational decisions, but we have cognitive limitations. We can't focus on everything at once. So we aren't completely rational. We seek second best alternatives that actually work out for us, because we don't have all the information and we can't handle all that information at one time. That's what Simon said. And so Baumgartner and Jones applied that to the way policy moves forward over time. So in a sense, it's a non-rational model, or it's at least an acceptance of cognitive limitations on the part of individual humans and legislative bodies. So again, this slide provides you a little more vocabulary to go with that previous diagram. So Macbeth and Clemens and Macbeth they're leaders in what's called the narrative policy framework, right? And some of this also comes from Deborah Stone, who's writing in this book called Policy Paradox in 2002. So what are they talking about? What they're talking about is that the world is socially constructed, and that narrative coalitions form to define the problem through stories. Okay, so I cut off that previous slide quicker than I wanted to, but I think that's okay because we really talked about that before. A really important idea that I want to talk about is something that Hogwood and Peters came up with in 1983, and they wrote a book on policy succession. So what were they talking about? What Hogwood and Peters asserted in 1983, and you could probably say it's still very true for any kind of policy domain at any level. They said that it's very rare for new policy to actually be created. What they said was that most policy that is created is really policy succession. And what they meant by that was that you're taking policy and you're layering on top of it and slightly modifying it to actually progress the same policy domains forward with different tweaks, if you will. So they said that what really happened in policy was a four-part diagram. So there's policy innovation, policy succession, policy maintenance, and policy termination. So policy innovation is brand new policy. It's purposely creating brand new policy where there's no existing organization and no existing law and no previous expenditure. So we could actually talk about their four-part thinking through Social Security again. So the policy innovation of Social Security was the original law in 1935, right? I'm going to complicate myself. There were actually state laws that provided a form of Social Security, but there had never been a national Social Security policy. So it was a brand new law, and it created the Social Security Administration, right? There had been no national expenditure on this area, and it created a way to expend money on for example, old age insurance and the other titles of the Social Security law of 1935. And that vehicle was, that expenditure vehicle, and actually the revenue vehicle was withholding. So what we call the payroll tax. So the statement you get from your employer that has income tax withheld for for the federal income tax and the state income tax, but then it has Social Security tax withheld and Medicare tax withheld, right? So those two things are part of the Social Security law. Medicare in 1965, but it was tacked onto the Social Security law. So the withholding tax, the payroll tax, was the revenue innovation that was created by the Social Security law of 1935. So that actually was an interesting innovation, withholding money directly from a worker's paycheck, because that innovation was used then later as World War II was spinning up, when the income tax itself was expanded so that normal workers paid more income tax. Before that, it really had just been people who earned a lot of income. But the withholding tax started for income tax in World War II, but it was based on the payroll tax, which was withheld for Social Security. So then we have policy succession, right? It is also a purposive type of effort. And so what that means is we're taking the same policy and we're leading to at least one organizational change, or we're superseding some part of the law, and there is already some existing expenditure. So policy succession in the case of Social Security could be represented by, among other things, Medicare, added in 1965. So Medicare used some of the same devices for implementation as the old age insurance, right? So it's policy succession. So then there's policy maintenance, and that is adaptive. So what that means in Hogwood and Peters' thinking is that policy maintenance means you're actually having to tweak the machinery to make it more effective. So an example of policy maintenance for Social Security is the COLA, the cost of living adjustment. So cost of living adjustments based on the Consumer Price Index formula started around 1969. And so the COLA that Social Security recipients receive now, whether the COLA is offered at all, whether it's 1%, 2%, 5%, based on the Consumer Price Index. That's a formula. And Congress, actually, the only thing Congress can change is the formula itself. So Congress could come along and say, we're going to base the COLA adjustment on some other thing besides the CPI. But what Congress can't do year to year is say, well, our deficit is to the point where there won't be any COLAs this year. They would have to change the law governing the formula to do that. So it's an adaptive formula, and so it creates, in a sense, it creates policy in and of itself, but it's really policy maintenance. And then there's policy termination, which is just what it sounds like, right? So it is also purposive, and we might, eliminate the entire organization and repeal all the legislation that has to do with it, and all expenditure ceases, right? So, no, we haven't done that with Social Security. You can think of policies where policy termination has happened, but you can think of a lot more policies where we've seen a lot of policy succession. And so this was the contribution of Hogwood and Peters, which was basically the general idea that rather than going through this policy cycle every single time and recreating policy, we're actually adjusting policy. So Clemens and Macbeth come up with this idea of pragmatic policy analysis, finally in chapter 6 of that reading. And I'm going to go through this over the next few slides. So step 1 is to define the problem and determine causes. And so the point of this is that explanations of the problem might change the way you analyze the policy. So look at this table. I don't want to confuse anybody. Don't look at this table in columns. Look at it from left to right. And so there's actually four. Think about the rows, not the columns. So for example, if we say drug abuse is the result of a breakdown of community institutions like family, churches, and schools, then move to the right, then therefore policy must be constructed to restore institutions. For example, school uniforms restore discipline, prayer in schools must be allowed, or things like expanded family leave. The next row, drug abuse is a result of individuals making choices. So that is, individuals make an informal cost-benefit analysis, but individuals actually make a choice to use harmful drugs. So therefore, we must create a policy to increase the cost of using drugs to outweigh the benefits. So, for example, mandatory sentencing and fines actually would increase very much the cost of using drugs, or harsh penalties for drug distribution. So what we're doing with those kinds of policies is we're increasing the cost of the undesirable behavior. So column 3, or row 3, drug abuse is a learned behavior that can be dealt with through education. So what is a policy prescription that comes to mind defining drug abuse that way? Well, we destigmatize drug use. We provide education and counseling efforts to help people make better choices, right? We're educating them on the harmful effects of drugs. And then we are providing them educated ways to quit using drugs. And the fourth row says, drug abuse includes not just illegal substances, but also prescription substances, legal substances. And so we could assert that drug companies and doctors have been given incentives to prescribe continued use of opiates, for example, and other drugs. And so what do we do about that? Well, we might remove incentives, right? You know, we could actually go to extremes and say we're going to nationalize drug companies, but we could also do other things. We could eliminate drug advertisements, or we could disincentivize doctors from prescribing opiates. And so what the point is, that the way you define a policy actually ends up affecting the way the policy alternatives that you might select. Then step 2 is establishing a criteria to evaluate alternatives. So how do you do that? You could use a technical feasibility, you could use an economic feasibility, you could use cost effectiveness, you could use political viability, you could use legality and ethics, you could use a risk analysis. I don't even have that listed there. So what does that mean? This actually gets to what we're talking about in this next part of your project. So a technical feasibility is, yeah, it might be feasible, but is there a need? Or it might be a great idea, but it's really, technically, it's really, really a hard idea, right? Technical feasibility really had a lot to do with the space program, and President Kennedy saying we are going to put a man on the moon within this decade. He said that in the early 60s. It was done in 1969. But the big challenge was technical feasibility. It had never been done before. And then there's economic feasibility and cost effectiveness, right? Exactly. Cost effectiveness, we talked about this. Cost effectiveness, the way you establish the cost factors and the benefit factors, has a lot to do with the values you insert in there. But even once you get past that, then you actually have to apply that across the board. Political viability. You might have a problem with a solution, but will it pass the political test? That is, will it actually pass the legislative body you might be talking about? And then legality and ethics, right? So legality and ethics sometimes compete with each other. Something might be legal, but it might not be ethical. So we have to actually weigh these in separately often. So step 3 is generate the policy alternatives, right? So how do you generate policy alternatives? I've talked to a couple of you about this. There's different ways to generate policy alternatives. You could have a best practices search at the city, for example. Who else is doing this and how well are they doing it? You know, what other cities are using community policing models besides my city? And how do those community policing models work? You could use experts. right? So there, that's a good strategy to use for highly technical issues, right? Um, what kind of uh, a good one actually is body-worn cameras by police, right? So what do we need? We don't just slap cameras on police officers. There's a lot of technical issues associated with that, not the least of which is how do we store the data from these cameras and how do we use the data from these cameras? And that's where people who understand the technicalities of storage um, of that data might be very helpful. And then there's client orientation, right? So what does your client or the affected population really want or need? That's actually important. There's brainstorming, right? You can actually get together with experts, stakeholders to do the kind of classic brainstorming exercise. Then there's the incremental approach, which I referred to. You could let's just tweak the system rather than revolutionize it, right? So if for example, a city department, say a parks department, wants to go to, electric vehicles for its work vehicles, maybe they would say, okay, this year we're going to buy 10 electric vehicles and see how they work. And then there's primary research, right? So that's actually doing surveys, interviews, focus groups to understand what these populations think about your policy. And then there's, from a pragmatic approach on policy alternatives, there is do nothing. Do nothing is often a solution that political entities use for a policy issue. We've studied the issue and we've decided to leave it as is. It's doing nothing is not necessarily a bad option in all cases. And then you evaluate and select the policy. So here's where I say, what you're really doing here is you're applying whatever criteria you established to analyze your policy across the board in a fair way, right? You might use stakeholders to help you evaluate, and Clemens and Macbeth talk about this. You might not, but you're actually applying an evaluation in a fair way. And then step 5 is to evaluate the policy that you adopted. Getting back to Hogwood and Peters, you don't go into a policy assuming that it's always going to work out fine forever. You're actually going to do policy succession in the future. And so Clemens and Macbeth talk about this thing called a Geller scorecard. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but I do have an example. So this is a Geller table from the Clemens and Macbeth reading. What I'm presenting here is not necessarily the exact way you would do this. But what I'm presenting here, I think, is sort of a frame. And the idea is that you took this policy and you had 3 alternatives, A, B, and C. And you decided you were going to evaluate the criteria based on cost, you were going to evaluate based on political feasibility, and you were going to evaluate it based on administrative feasibility. And you established some definitions for what those meant. And then you decided, based on your information, that cost has a weight of 3, political feasibility has a weight of 2, and administrative feasibility has a weight of 1. And you're going to decide between alternatives A, B, and C based on the score that you give each one, right? So alternative A costs $50,000, alternative B costs $60,000, and alternative C costs $35,000. And cost is your weightiest of your 3 criteria. So alternative A has let me start with alternative C. Alternative C has the lowest cost. So by your weighting, that's the best one, right? So you would take 3 times 3. So you would say 3 because it's better, and 3 because that's the weight. So alternative C has a weight of 9. Alternative B is the most expensive, right? That gives it a score of 1. 1 times your weight. So it has a score of 3, and alternative A is somewhere in the middle with a score of 6. So you do that with political feasibility, and you do that with administrative feasibility. You take the score of each one and you multiply it by the weight, and you come up with a score at the end. And so what this is telling you is you're tied between A and C, right? You're tied between the low cost one and the one in the middle. So what that tells you in this hypothetical example is that low cost doesn't carry the day, right? So the old saw about we put a man on the moon using technology developed by the lowest bidder. Well, that really wasn't the truth in the space program, and it's actually not the truth um, in government procurement anyway, right? And that's how we come up with value-based contracting. And this is kind of an example of that. So the point is that you could actually apply various criteria to your decision on which policy to implement. So there's my references. Again, no discussion this week. There is the due in on the 16th of March, and I look forward to reading that. Thank you.